Hi everyone, my name is Sam Sharp and I'm very excited to talk to you today about developing LGBTQIA plus inclusive biology classrooms and curricula. I'd like to give a disclaimer that I'm recovering from oral surgery which is affecting my enunciation. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation on stolen land that is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. If you're not in the same place I am, you can use this tool to learn more about what ancestral land you are on. And I'd also like to note that as we discuss cultivating respectful attitudes and practices to support sex and gender diversity, we acknowledge that European colonists historically targeted, stigmatized, and oppressed indigenous peoples for having cultural gender roles beyond the male-female binary, and that this violence continues today. I'd also like to share a quote from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who writes, "We learn about worlds when they do not accommodate us. Not being accommodated can be pedagogy. We generate ideas through the struggles we have to be in the world. We come to question worlds when we are in question." So I have a question for all of you, which is, what do students learn about human sex, gender, and sexuality in biology classes, and how might this not be accommodating for all of our students? So the way that we teach about biology frequently in our late high school and early college classes, which will be, for many students, their last exposure to biology content in a classroom if they do not major in this subject, is that sex in humans is binary, entirely chromosomal, and fixed at conception. It only comes in 2 flavors. And the way that we teach sexuality is through diagrams like this, which not only conflate sex and gender by showing the donors of different gametes and chromosomes described by gendered terms, we're also showing a reproductive event that is based on a heterosexual, reproductively oriented relationship. And frequently, no other versions of sex, gender, or sexuality are shown in our textbooks and course materials. So how is this not accommodating to all of our students? So for our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual students, there is no representation. And for our straight, cisgender, and endosex students, they are receiving the message that only their genders, bodies, and relationships are normal, natural, and biological, and they do not need to consider others. Additionally, this can decrease the likelihood of LGBTQIA+ students pursuing science further if they don't see themselves represented within biology. And it can enforce homophobic and transphobic arguments about what is biological sex or what is a natural reproductive pairing and relationship. These echo the types of arguments that weaponize misunderstandings of biology politically to try and discriminate against these populations. And something that I want to specifically touch on before I move into the rest of the presentation is the history of the sex and gender binary. Because many of us, even if we understand the biological exceptions to an idea of a sex-gender binary or a sex binary, believe that this comes out of biology and is therefore an approximate universal truth. However, it comes from a specific political history. And so this starts with, prior to the 1800s, the leading hypothesis about human sex is that all human bodies were variations of one sex, with male bodies being the superior version and female bodies being the inferior version. During the 1800s, when gonads were discovered, there was a shift from a one-sex model to a two-sex model, with gonads creating opposing types. During this time, these discoveries were happening in a scientific and political environment that involved a lot of race science. And so sexual dimorphism was viewed as an inherently racial trait, and eugenicists and sexologists claimed that non-white ethnic groups were less sexually dimorphic than what they believed to be the most evolved humans, which were heterosexual Europeans. There was also an idea that certain Europeans who were degenerate, including lesbians and sex workers, were less sexually dimorphic than these pinnacly evolved heterosexual Europeans. And this pseudoscience of biometrics based on body measurements was used to provide supposed support to these differences and went on to be used to justify eugenic laws and projects, including experimentation and state surveillance of these populations. In the 1900s, additional technologies were developed that allowed not only categorization of biological sex, but also for it to be altered. So genital reconstructive surgeries were developed in the early 1900s, and in the 1950s they began to be deployed as forced operations on non-consenting intersex infants, while at the same time the same procedures were being heavily limited and gate-kept from consenting transgender adults. And 70 years later, we continue to see sex and gender being racialized, conflated with one another, and used to deny access and autonomy to marginalized people. There are many examples of this, including bathroom bills used to limit trans people's ability to access public accommodation, bills meant to prevent transgender girls and women from competing in sports, the disqualification of intersex women of color from athletics, the requirement for trans people to be sterilized to obtain correct legal documentation in many states, and forced hysterectomies performed in ICE detention facilities. So this is a picture of Gavin Grimm, a transgender student who sued his high school because he was not allowed to use the correct bathroom based on discrimination against him for being transgender. And these are pictures of Christine Mboma and Beatrice Masalinghi, who were recently disqualified from competing in the Olympics because they were believed to have testosterone levels that exceeded a subjective standard for what the International Olympic Committee defined as biological female. So the problems illustrated on this slide and the history from which they come cannot be dismantled simply by how we teach biology, but I do believe there is a big difference we can make in terms of how we teach biology if we can push back on these false binaries of biological sex and gender. And one way that we can do this is looking outside just the scope of human diversity. We can look at sex diversity across taxa and teach students that not all species have two different sexes and reproduce sexually. Some species just have one sex and reproduce asexually, such as the New Mexico whiptail lizards. Some species have thousands of mating types, including mushrooms in the family Basidiomycota. Some species have sexual reproduction but don't have sexes separate in different bodies, including snails and most flowering plants, and some species can switch from a fertile adult of one sex to a fertile adult of another sex during their lifetime, including clownfish. When we do talk about the separation of sex into different bodies, we can be specific about what this means and how it varies. So frequently in animals and plants, sex differences boil down to the size of gametes that an individual produces, even though pretty much every other trait that can be sexually dimorphic varies widely. So once we have established the importance of difference in gamete size, we can talk about variation in whether both these size gametes are produced in a single individual, as in monoece, or whether we need separate individuals to produce ova and sperm, as in dioece. And in dioece, we can talk about the variety of sex determination strategies, including chromosomal, environmental, and social. When we talk about human biological sex, I think nuance is especially important given the history we're trying to counteract. So I prefer to talk about sex characteristics in humans rather than focusing on distinct sex categories. Humans have primary sex characteristics which are present at birth, and we can discuss which of these are used in the social and legal process of designating a binary sex. We can talk about secondary sex characteristics and how, like primary sex characteristics, all of these different things vary along a spectrum in contrast to the legal mandates to give everybody a binary sex marker on their birth certificate. And we can talk about intersex people who have bodies that defy a common understanding of sex as a simple male and female binary, and how this is at least 2% of the population. We can illustrate how different sex characteristics, including external genitals, vary along a spectrum by using diagrams such as the Quigley scale. So in contrast to the binary model of human sex determined by the presence of two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome at birth, as was shown in an earlier slide, we can show complex diagrams such as the Scientific American infographic that shows how many different factors interact with each other to make up human biological sex. And I would also like to briefly mention the importance of at least briefly addressing gender in biology classes, and some people might ask, why should I teach about gender in biology class? And my answer to this question is that not teaching about gender is teaching about gender, because gender is a form of cultural categorization, and gender identity is a relationship to those categories. And so gender is a question that we can ask ourselves: what, if any, of the gender categories in my culture do I feel I belong to? And we can also be aware of the fact that historical and modern cultures frequently have had more than two accepted gender categories, and even in cultures that only have two widely accepted gender categories, there remain individuals who do not fit into either of them. And in addition to the importance of not falling into this misconception that sex and gender are the same thing and sex determines gender, which is frequently communicated through the conflation of sex and gender terms in biology materials, we can also acknowledge the importance of how gender affects the ways that people make choices which affect their biology. Technologies exist through hormones and surgeries that can allow people of a variety of genders to alter their sex characteristics to better affirm their gender, which is something that transgender and cisgender individuals frequently do by taking hormones or getting different medical procedures. And finally, I want to provide some additional tips for ways that we can make biology classrooms more inclusive for our LGBTQIA+ students. We can ask students about which name, pronouns, and accessibility needs they have before the first day of class so they do not face misgendering in class. We can clarify inclusion policies for this population explicitly in our syllabus. We can choose texts with diverse representation, and if such texts are not available, we can point out ways in which they are not inclusive and provide more inclusive information. We can be specific when defining and using biological sex, rather than relying on this idea that biological sex is just an assumed and universal binary. We can avoid gendering non-human organisms and avoid playing into gender stereotypes which frequently pervade even texts about things such as gametes. We can use gamete-focused language rather than constantly defaulting to male and female and saying things like ova-producing tissue and sperm-producing structure. We can provide examples of variations in investment, courtship, gestation, and parental care across taxa, such as the image on the slide, which shows seahorses, in which the male is the gestational parent. And we can advocate for including LGBTQIA+ individuals in diversity initiatives. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and please reach out to me through email or follow me on Twitter if you would like to continue this very important presentation. Thank you again for your time.